Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. Just a few program notes. Next week we are off so that you can enjoy your turkey and recover from your tryptophan. I don't know what it is it a high, a tryptophan high? And then the following week we will be back, and that's when I'm going to give the talk that I had planned for last week. Well, if you missed it, then you have the opportunity to hear it next week. I'm going to talk about the Reform movement and Humanistic Judaism, and how they didn't almost take us over, but how we declared our independence, quite by accident, from the Reform movement. So you'll hear the whole story next week. The following week is Super Supper. So we still need, I understand, some soup makers and some bread bakers, and we're going to have some singing. We bought a new freestanding speaker so that we could sing a little louder on Hanukkah. So there seems to be a murmur in this room of some kind. It's not me. And then on the 15th, our guest, our guest who was originally scheduled for tonight, Representative Samantha Steckloff, she will appear. She graciously set aside the date so that we could talk about these pressing events tonight. Our readers this evening are Greg Campo, Sue Shalom, Janice Young, Lonnie Fleischer, Frank Mandelbaum, Sheila Glass and Frank Mandelbaum. And we're in a moment going to invite Rabbi Miriam Jairus to light our candles, but first we'll turn our slide to our first reading. To light candles everywhere, that is Shabbat. To light Shabbat candles is a leap of our spirits, pregnant with potential, into a splendid sea where we can contemplate the mystery of the fire of sunset. Lighting the candles transforms our space into that legendary river of fire where our hearts set in an emerald waterfall. I'd like to invite Rabbi Jairus. We'll light our candles and say our blessing. Accompanied by Sue. They're more than friends, you know. They share grandchildren. And children. Yes, that too. Baruch haor ba'olam. Baruch haor ba'adam. Baruch haor ba'shalom. Ba'shalom. Baruch haor. Baruch haor. Ba'shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
When we meet each other on Shabbat, we think of Shalom, peace. It's right there in the greeting. Shabbat has always been a symbol of peace. Our congregation's ancestors called it a taste of the world to come. The peace that they sought to create on Shabbat teased them with hopes that such calm might one day prevail throughout the world. Perhaps it was just a fantasy, but it gave them comfort nonetheless. Today we understand that if we desire such a world, it must come through our own work. Perhaps Shabbat can remind us of that. Shabbat Shalom, to a Sabbath of peace.
Teka Israel Ma Tovu Alecha Yaakov Alecha Yaakov Mishkenoteka Israel Likrat Shabbat Lechu v'neilcha Teka Yisrael.
At one with our forebears, we affirm that righteousness and enlightenment shall be our torch. We shall teach these values diligently to our children all the days of our lives. We shall endeavor to live by these values in the comfort of our homes or on cold and windswept roads. Whether adversity bows our heads or fulfillment makes our spirits soar, our hands shall mete out justice to all, and our eyes shall be open to the light of truth. We shall emblazon our paths through life with this light as a beacon for all humanity.
My light is in me. Where is my hope? My hope is in me. Where is my strength? My strength is in me. And in you, and in you. Where is my strength? My strength is in me. And in you, and in you.
Let us strive to lead loving, compassionate lives with our hearts, with our wisdom, and with our actions. These words we inscribe in our innermost being, aspiring to practice them day and night, teaching them diligently to our children, through our words and especially through our deeds, so that the next generations may learn to revere and celebrate life.
נפתח לנו שערי צדק, חן וחסד ורחמים. נפתח לנו שערי צדק, חן וחסד ורחמים. אלה שרים לשלום, נפתח לנו ונבובם. אלה שרים לשלום, נפתח לנו ונבובם. נפתח לנו שערי צדק, חן וחסד ורחמים. נפתח לנו שערי צדק, חן וחסד ורחמים.
Lonnie?
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Robert Ingersoll, who was a great agnostic and critical of the Bible, one of the towering humanists of the 19th century, wrote, "If abuses are destroyed, we must destroy them. If slaves are freed, we must free them. If new truths are discovered, we must discover them. If the naked are clothed, if the hungry are fed, if justice is done, if labor is rewarded, if superstition is driven from the mind, if the defenseless are protected, and if right finally triumphs, all must be the work of our hands. The grand victories of the future must be won by us and us alone."
לא עליך המלאכה לגמור, לא עליך לגמור, לא עליך המלאכה לגמור, לא עליך לגמור, ולא אתה בן חורין להיבטל ממנה, ולא אתה בן חורין, ולא אתה בן חורין להיבטל ממנה, ולא אתה בן חורין. לא עליך המלאכה לגמור, לא עליך לגמור, לא עליך המלאכה לגמור, לא עליך לגמור.
On February 14th, 1990, as the first deep space probe Voyager 1 left our planetary neighborhood for the fringes of the solar system, engineers turned it around for one last look at its home planet, now 4 billion miles away. Carl Sagan wrote, "Look at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known.
Nase shalom ba'olam, nase shalom aleinu, ve'al kol ha'olam ve'imru shalom. Nase Shalom ba'olam, shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol ha'olam, ve'imru shalom, shalom. Na'aseh shalom ba'olam, na'aseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol ha'olam ve'imru shalom. Na'aseh shalom ba'olam, shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol ha'olam ve'imru shalom, shalom.
In this community where we find strength and common purpose, we turn our minds and hearts toward all those who need our love and support, those who are ill, those who suffer pain of the body or spirit, those who are lonely, those who have been wronged. Tonight, we extend our well wishes to these members of our community and to their loved ones, to Nitzan Ben-Gal, Rabbi Peter Schweitzer, Jim Walker, and Kate Ben-Ami. If there's someone whom you're thinking about tonight to whom you'd like to extend our well wishes, please do so as we go around the room. Anybody on this side? Natan? Is she okay? Yeah. Anybody else on this side? Anybody over here? Well, our hearts are with them, and Beth, of course. May all who suffer know that they are not alone, that we are there. May they be healed quickly. May they experience a refuah shlema, a complete recovery, the renewal of their bodies and the renewal of their spirits. At darker times in Jewish history, there came a moment such as this during Jewish services when prayers were offered for those held hostage. Sadly, we once again find ourselves in such a reality. Let us now, in the spirit of our ancestors who lived through those terrible days, offer these fervent hopes. May those taken captive find the courage to carry on. May those who love them not despair of their return. May they soon emerge from their confinement whole in body and in spirit to know once again the embrace of loved ones.
מקום הכוח בתוכנו, מקורות הברכה מחברותינו. May the source of strength that dwells so deep within us help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say Shalom. Mekom hakoach betochenu, mekorot habracha michavrotenu. May those in need of healing know refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Shalom.
If I should die and leave you here a while, be not like others sore undone, who keep long vigil by the silent dust. For my sake, turn again to life and smile, nerving thy heart and trembling hand, to do something to comfort other hearts than mine. Complete these dear, unfinished tasks of mine, and I, perchance, may therein comfort you.
Our thoughts turn to those who are no longer with us, our own loved ones, those whom our friends and neighbors have lost, the martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked, and those of every people and nation whose lives have been a blessing to humanity. As we remember them, we meditate on the meaning of love and loss, of life and death. We recall now our loved ones whom death has recently taken from us, those who died at this season in years past, and those whom we have taken into our hearts with our own. Tonight, we observe the yahrzeits of these members of our community and of their loved ones: Michael Beltzman, Robert Campo, Joseph Ernst, Joseph Fastovsky, Peter Friedman, Greta Haas, Jody Lind Lutz, Daniel Mandelbaum, Leo Mann, Phyllis Mello, Edna Morris, Beatrice Moss, Leon Pius, Regina Pius, Isaac Rinsky, Libby Sherbin, Barbara Shore, and Clara Stawicki. As we did earlier for those who are ill, in need of support, we do now with those who have left us. If anybody would like to add a name to that list, please do. Anybody on this side? Anybody over here? Miriam? Judith Robert. Diana? Did we miss anyone? Yehi zichram livracha, we say. May memories of them provide a blessing. As we go through life in their absence, may we from time to time recall them with joy and therein be comforted, as our poem said. If you can, do so comfortably, I invite you to rise for our humanistic interpretation of Kaddish. Together, Nit Gadal v'nit Kadash beruach ha'adam. Let us dignify and ennoble all people in the spirit of our shared humanity. Let us acclaim the preciousness of life. Let us show gratitude for life by approaching it with reverence. Let us embrace the whole world, even as we wrestle with its parts. Let us each in our own way take up our share in serving the world and seeking truth. May our commitment to life help us to strengthen healing of spirit and peace of mind. May justice and peace permeate and comfort the house of Israel and all those who dwell on earth. And let us say, Ken Yehi, may it be so. Please be seated. So this is a little bit of a maybe longer presentation than I usually give. So I thought about whether or not we were going to have discussion afterwards, and I think probably it's best just to leave that to the Oneg Shabbat. You may find that there's nothing to discuss. You may find that there's everything to discuss. But hopefully I'll leave you with some things to think about. It's also a discussion that we probably should have had a couple weeks ago, or certainly not last week, but we had other things going on, including the wonderful celebration that we shared, and that meant that a lot of people had already left town by this evening. And I know many of them, because I got a lot of emails, are watching them now or will be watching this recorded. So we are not alone by any means in this room. Not 1 week had passed since the outrages committed by Hamas, when our congregation received its first request to sign on to a multi-synagogue letter calling for a ceasefire. A letter that arrived before Israel had taken any significant military action. This letter, which was issued by a group that, frankly, I'd never heard of, wasn't very well written and it didn't gain much, if any, support from other synagogues, but its arrival happened to coincide with our October Board of Trustees meeting. And so I asked our president, Elaine Fieldman, to allow me to bring it before the board. My reasons were twofold. First, I wanted them to be aware that there would be many such letters that we as a congregation would be asked to sign. And second, I wanted to request of them that no matter what letters we as a congregation are asked to sign regarding Israel's then planned or now ongoing military actions, my recommendation, at least under the present circumstances, would be that we decline. I did not ask this of the board because we have some tradition of not signing on to letters. Our board has taken positions on behalf of the congregation, and we have signed on to letters. But we have always done so when, and only when, the cause that we are being asked to support enjoys a healthy consensus of opinion in our movement or in our congregation. Separation of church and state, women's reproductive rights, LGBTQ equality come to mind. The Israeli-Hamas war happens not to fall under that category. Neither our congregation nor the Humanistic Jewish movement at large have ever been sufficiently united to sign on to or issue collective statements of the type that have been circulating since the dreadful day of October 7th. This is not to say, however, that our own congregation is in complete disagreement and disarray when it comes to aspects of the issues that have been taking center stage since that horrible day. We are, in fact, more united than many Jewish congregations, even more united than many humanistic Jewish congregations, but certainly not on every facet of what's going on at this moment. Tonight, I want to talk about where we, as a unique movement, a unique congregation in the Jewish world, stand at this moment in time on 4 different issues about where the prevailing sentiment in our movement and congregation is more or less aligned with the majority of world Jewry, at least according to my subjective account, and about where, at least at this moment in time, with Israel and Hamas at war, we may not see eye to eye, not with each other, and at least in the case of a sizable minority of members, not with the majority of the Jewish world. The four issues I want to address are admittedly interconnected, but I will do my best to separate them. The first concerns the nature and the goals of Hamas. The second is the alarming rise in anti-Semitism here and all over the world, something that we have focused on in the past, primarily as a phenomenon of the right, and that has now become a more and more visible problem on the left. The third issue I want to address is the larger picture of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the parts that concern the policies of Netanyahu, the role of the settler movement, and the rise of the religious nationalists in Israel on the right. The fourth and final issue that I'll address concerns our different positions on calls for an immediate ceasefire in the current conflict between Hamas and Israel. As I make my way through these four issues, I will inevitably engage in some, perhaps for some individual tastes, a bit too much generalization as I characterize our areas of unity and disagreement. No presentation of this sort can possibly capture the subtleties of each individual point of view. So I apologize in advance to those of you who may not agree with what I see as being general areas of unity. I do believe, however, that by the volume of conversations and emails that I receive, my analysis of these is more right than wrong. If you don't see yourself in what I characterize as an area of broad agreement, do not assume that I do not see you or that your opinion does not count. Rather, please understand that like our movement itself, your point of view may simply be an outlier. This doesn't bear on its correctness. It speaks only to the prevailing sentiment. Let's begin with a look at the general Jewish agreement that I have seen concerning the true nature and goals of Hamas. Throughout the Jewish world, there has been a strong and really I have detected a unanimous feeling of collective horror and outrage about Hamas's slaughter of some 1,200 Israelis. You've heard different numbers. About 200 of the people who were also killed were there trying to defend or protect the civilians, and the kidnapping of many more than 200 others. At the same time, many Jews who are heavily aligned and allied with social justice and anti-racism groups and causes have been baffled by many of the left-wing responses to Hamas. This, they believe, and there are hundreds of articles about this that you can go and Google, represents a failure of these groups to recognize the truth about Hamas. Maybe other things too, but for now, I'll stick to that. It is a failure that has both enraged and disappointed a very large number of liberal and progressive Jews. Even as the targeted and horrific murders conducted by Hamas, a terrorist organization that has brutally ruled over the 2.3 million people of Gaza, were still ongoing before the end of that very day. Many on the left were applauding their actions. I spoke about this the week after. They were either oblivious to, or one can only assume, completely supportive of Hamas's true nature as a right-wing, religious, extremist organization. On that Shabbat, following the October 7th massacre, I shared with you the glee expressed by some of these people, by the national leadership of Students for Justice in Palestine, who declared that weekend's events a historic win for the Palestinian resistance, as they touted Hamas's success in catching the enemy, the civilians, asleep in their beds, completely by surprise, unprotected by their defense army. There were statements by members of the Democratic Socialists of America, including the Connecticut chapter, which applauded Hamas's unprecedented anti-colonial struggle and pledged its solidarity, vowing no peace on stolen land, as if the name Connecticut was not a bastardization of a Native American Mohican Pico word. Many of these expressions of support took the position that Hamas is entitled and fully justified in its targeting and its savagery towards civilians. The sexual brutality that sadly has now been repeatedly confirmed, the horrific and torturous murders, the beheadings, the burnings, the kidnappings, and so much more. By any means necessary, they say, as if the lessons of nonviolent resistance mean nothing. Parenthetically, I discovered just yesterday that millions of these so-called social justice warriors have now discovered that Osama bin Laden wrote about his support for Palestinians. And this, they are tweeting, in the millions, justified his attack on the Twin Towers. These are members of Generation Z, most of whom were not alive at the time. Even over at the Jewish Current's website, among the most anti-Zionist and harshly critical of Israel, Hamas is seen for what it is. Over there, you'll read about a repressive organization harshly punishing dissent among Gazans, enforcing a religiously conservative social order, to say the least. The far left website and its magazine has quoted scholars who specialize in Hamas, describing that organization as fueling hatred, even as it represses any forms of dissent or calls for change right there in Gaza where it rules. It notes, Jewish Currents, that Hamas is responsible for Gaza's widespread poverty, even its regular power outages, that this is due to its prioritization of military goals to engage in escalations with Israel, which wind up, of course, costing lives in Gaza. Jews across the world, especially on the left, have been nauseated to witness the wide-scale left-wing ignorance of what Hamas represents. I've seen signs at more than one protest that say "Queers for Hamas." Imagine the profound ignorance of the reality that whoever these queer people are holding these signs, well, they may be for Hamas, but Hamas is anything but for them. Jews across the world, including many who are very, very pro-Palestinian, have long recognized that recognized Hamas, for the religious right-wing extremist group that it is, and innately anti-Semitic, and proudly so, as reflected in its charter, which proclaims, "The day of judgment will not come about," and that's an important date for Muslims, "until Muslims fight Jews and kill them. Then the Jews will hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees will cry out, 'O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him.'" Now, none of this is to say that all Jews are united on the question of whether Israel's treatment of Palestinians has, wittingly or unwittingly, encouraged support for Hamas. That remains a separate and enormously complicated question, not time to address this evening. But understanding Hamas's true nature as a religious extremist terror organization dedicated to creating a world that any rational supporter of human rights would immediately reject, on that, the Jewish world at least seems to be in agreement. This now takes me to our next issue, the enormous rise in anti-Semitism engendered by the events on and since October 7th. No matter where any given groups of Jews may stand on the larger issues of Israel, of the occupation of Palestinian rights, there has also been overwhelming agreement, as I see it, that, quote, attacking Jewish individuals or communal spaces for being Jewish or blaming the Jewish people for the actions of the Israeli government is anti-Semitic and is unacceptable. This very rational approach to anti-Semitism came from none other than the website of JVP, the Jewish Voice for Peace. And I don't think there's anyone among us who could disagree. And that therefore, regardless of where one stands on the spectrum of the far left, and for those of you who don't know, JVP is the far left of the Jewish community on this issue, I don't think there's any of us who disagree. It is impossible that the 1,200 civilians, mostly Jews, who were ruthlessly murdered, and the over 240, mostly Jewish men, women, children, babies, who were kidnapped on October 7th, could possibly have been a sign of protest for the Israeli government's policies. I don't think babies make policies. The joyful and supportive reactions to these acts of infamy that emerged even while the slaughter was still in progress, and long before any Israeli military reaction had commenced, quickly spread throughout the world. Jewish communities worldwide were not granted even one moment's grace to mourn what was done to our fellow Jews, precisely, obviously, because they were Jewish, without distinction to their attitudes toward Israeli policies. Among the dead and those who were seized were a large number of opponents of Israeli policies, what seemed tended to be left-wing, peace-oriented. We've learned that some of them were indeed committed peace activists who had devoted their lives to Palestinian rights. It took but hours for the most radical supporters of Hamas to rally behind them, both the well-meaning and the thoroughly anti-Semitic, whose pretended support, obviously pretended support for human rights, has included vandalizing synagogues, Jewish schools, and Jewish homes throughout the world, threatening Jews on college campuses, disrupting religious services there and elsewhere, threatening Jews with death, violently attacking counter-protesters, in at least one case in this country, killing a man in California. I have in my possession a growing and very depressing collection of videos where Jewish individuals and groups are being verbally and physically assaulted, called kikes. One of these was from my hometown of Miami Beach, of all places, where protesters were chanting, "Hitler had the right idea." In Sydney, protesters are chanting, "Fuck the Jews." In London, Jewish businesses and synagogues have been vandalized. In Paris, homes marked with Stars of David, a Jewish woman assaulted in her home. On Holocaust museums and Jewish institutions of every type, Gaza and Free Palestine have been painted, sometimes accompanied by variations on "Kill the Jews," and of course the ubiquitous swastikas. Here at home, the FBI has recorded hundreds of clearly anti-Semitic attacks and incidents since October 7th, documenting an increase so far of more than 20% from the same period next year, with reports still coming in. And I should point out that while this count covers a lot of activities, it doesn't include participation in pro-Palestinian rallies. That's not what the FBI is talking about. The FBI Director, Christopher Wray, recently testified before Congress that the rise in anti-Semitism here at home is now reaching historic levels. It's coming from both the far right, and yes, they also are attacking Israel on issues of Gaza and Jews everywhere. If you're interested, you might want to see the mind-boggling debates and arguments and fallings out between Ben Shapiro and the people over at The Wire, the right-wing website that he founded. It's really stunning to see these people attacking him. Director Wray noted that for a group that represents only 2.4% of the American public, anti-Semitic incidents now are accounting for 60% of all religious-based And that's what the FBI calls them, hate crimes. And there's no question that there's a climate of growing fear among our community and our friends' community. As reported in the Jewish Forward, Jewish day schools have canceled classes, synagogues have been locked. You know what we've done here. We started that before, but now it has ramped into overdrive, protection at our synagogue. Social media is pulsing with hatred against Jews, leaving a community that can never escape its historic trauma, yet again wondering where and when it can ever be safe. This rising hate, the Forward says, is tangible. Referencing the threats to kill all the Jews at Cornell University, for which at least one individual has been arrested, the Forward continues. The idea that Jewish Americans studying at Cornell could so fear for their lives on their Ivy League campus in rural New York that they could not even eat together in the kosher dining hall in 2023 seems almost impossible to believe. Yet it's the case after death threats were posted online. And of course, this professor said he was initially exhilarated over the Hamas attacks. As all of this has been going on, Jews have also been subject to an emerging massacre denialism that mirrors the Holocaust denialism that we faced for decades. It happened almost instantaneously. Posters of hostages are torn down everywhere. Ridiculous claims are made about the veracity of the videos, that they're crisis actors, that it's AI. The murderers themselves proudly created these videos to document their self-satisfaction with killing and capturing 1,400 civilians. There are recordings that were intercepted, that were found in WhatsApp cell phones, where terrorists are texting, bragging to their parents, "I just killed 10 Jews. Heaven awaits me." Even as I have personally argued many, many times, as you know, that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are not necessarily the same thing, Jews today have every reason to feel that these two seem to be merging, and rapidly. When Rashida Tlaib chants from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, there is indeed something a little bit more than disingenuous about her claims that this chant is no more than, as she said, an aspirational call for freedom, human rights, and peaceful coexistence, not death, destruction, or hate. It is a call, she says, always centered in justice and dignity for all people, no matter their faith or ethnicity. Well, if this were true, if it is true, I'd like to strongly suggest to Representative Tlaib, who has stood on this bima, a guest at my invitation, that perhaps she should change it to say, from the river to the sea, all people will be free. It still rhymes, doesn't it? But she and those who join her in chanting it have chosen not to change it. And when people cry for only a free Palestine, there is no question in their minds that Israel is to be erased. Unless you think I'm being one-sided on this, I will note that Israelis do the same thing. They do it in their own way, and I've protested it many times when I've seen it. Israeli commercial advertisements frequently depict the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, without any demarcation of the green line. The maps issued by the government there also engage in this. The charter of the Likud party itself includes river to the sea language, by which it means that it all belongs to Israel and Israel alone. Well, this is anti-Palestinian, of course. So why would we not regard Palestine shall be free as anti-Jewish? My mother taught me 2 wrongs don't make something right. From this river and sea language, I want to move on now to the 3rd issue. Unlike the first 2 issues I've presented, neither World Jewry nor even, I am told, Humanistic Jews share the same degree of consensus. But judging from my 10 years in our congregation, 10 years that have included very many presentations and speakers and special events examining Israeli politics and related issues, our congregation has actually been quite unified in its opposition to the Israeli right-wing policies that have characterized the last decade and a half, and really much more, in Israel. We seem to share, I've never heard anybody say anything different here, a very clear and morally centered opposition to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his allies on the deluded religious Zionist, what we call the Messianist right wing, because they believe, of course, that by settling the land, Mashiach will come. And now, of course, we're not alone in the Jewish world. On Tuesday, that historic Jewish march on Washington, historic in the sense that, you may not know this, it was the largest gathering of Jews in this country in American history. There was a Jewish peace bloc participating there to call for the return of the hostages, to mourn what Hamas did and to condemn it, but also to express hope for truth, for peace rather. One of the organizations that I belong to, Teruah, the Rabbinical Call for Human Rights, was there. They and many others came to generally support Israelis and the return of the hostages, but not, most explicitly not, to support Netanyahu and his government's policies. Some of them held signs declaring themselves to be anti-Bibi. I was very pleased to see that all throughout the crowd. We're pro-peace, anti-Bibi. In Israel, too, that sentiment is taking hold, as his support is now down to less than 28% was the last I saw. It's unsurprising. Most now realize that he failed his nation in his single most important duty, that of any leader, to protect them. And this was the result of his own policies, stated by the man himself, to tolerate and even support the rule of Hamas in Gaza. Maybe you didn't know this. Netanyahu has for years tolerated and supported Hamas. Why? Well, I'll let him and his supporters speak for themselves. This happens to be one of many articles that I found. I like this one because it was in that notoriously left-wing Israeli journal, the Jerusalem Post. Good. The laughter shows that most of you understand that the Jerusalem Post is anything but right-wing. Here from a news story in 2019. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu defended today Israel's regular allowance of Qatari funds to be transferred into Gaza, saying that it is part of a broader strategy to keep Hamas and the Palestinian Authority separate. Netanyahu explained in a recent Likud meeting that in the past, the Palestinian Authority transferred the millions of dollars to Hamas to Gaza, but he argued that it was better for Israel to serve as the pipeline to ensure the funds don't go to terrorism. Now that we are supervising, he said, we know it's going to humanitarian causes. He obviously knew, as did anyone with I don't know, minimum senses, that that money was never going to humanitarian causes. So then what was the real reason that he tolerated the Qatari money and all the rest of the money that was coming in, when he absolutely knew that it was not there to help Palestinians in Gaza? Well, here's what he said with his own mouth. Whoever is against a Palestinian state should be for transferring these funds to Gaza, because maintaining a separation between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, signatories to the Oslo Accord, supporters of a two-state solution, whoever supports maintaining the separation between them and Hamas in Gaza helps prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. Since Bibi's return to power, this time supported by the most right-wing, nationalist, Jewish supremacist, in most cases right-wing deluded messianists, from the Jewish Power Party and the National Union Party, Netanyahu has doubled and tripled down on this policy, even as he has expanded or permitted to expand the settlements in the West Bank, the violence that is being done there to Palestinians, the vandalism to their orchards, their vineyards, etc. In doing so, he, of course, chose to ignore the security threat that Hamas has always posed to Israelis. In fact, he delighted in Hamas's own repression, you just heard it, of Palestinians, because that also meets his agenda. that Hamas could so easily break into Israel and conduct their massacre was a direct result of Netanyahu and his government's thin and completely underprepared security at Gaza. Where has his security been thick and overly active? In the West Bank, mostly protecting settlers, those of the most extreme variety, many of them from the hardcore movement. He's protecting them from the so-called threat of Palestinians, the very Palestinians that they are constantly harassing. Right now, it's looking like Israelis have finally had it with him. Hopefully, he will be gone when this is all over. Perhaps he'll be replaced by some people who want real peace when this is over. But I'm not prepared to make predictions or promises, because who would have thought 2 years ago that Trump would be on his way back to the White House? Okay, so far, I have outlined 2 areas of concern that unify what seems to be the majority of the Jewish world: the true nature of Hamas and the attendant disappointment that a large majority of Jews, particularly those on the left, feel about the lack of rational thinking among their fellow social justice supporters and so forth. And number 2, the dread fear we are experiencing about the growth of anti-Semitism throughout the diaspora and aimed towards Israel, of course. And of course, now I've just added to these 2 issues what I have proposed is a more or less agreed upon, at least in our congregation, antipathy to the ongoing policies of Israel's right-wing dominated government, recently made worse by the renewed emphasis on West Bank settlement, with its encroaching apartheid on the West Bank, and our growing despair of ever seeing a 2-state solution come to fruition. And you would think that if Israel was seeking right now, I'm just adding this, the world's sympathy, they would rein in these clowns on the West Bank. But Israel is not thinking properly about that. And this brings me to the final issue of the 4 that I promised to talk about, which concerns our own congregation's lack of unity about an immediate ceasefire in the conflict as it's going on right now. When I recommended to our board that we refrain from signing on to that letter, or others like them, it was not due to them addressing any of the 3 areas that I've spoken about. They weren't about the evil of Hamas or anti-Semitism or, we condemn Israel's treatment of the Palestinians on the West Bank. We could have agreed on those things. We never received a request like that, and we're not likely to. The letters that we are being asked to sign off on, the marches we are being invited to, these are the ones that call upon the U.S. and or Israel to undertake an immediate ceasefire. So I mentioned earlier that our movement has frequently been divided over all kinds of issues with Israel. When the Society for Humanistic Judaism recently posted a variety of responses by our rabbis and others throughout the movement about what's going on right now, the section carried this disclaimer, just in part. Within the Humanistic Judaism movement, we have the full diversity of political positions as it relates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I've already said that may not be true here in general, but throughout our movement it is. SHJ refrains from official statements on issues where we cannot speak for a significant majority of our movement. Broadly, we at SHJ are devastated by the autumn 2023 events in Israel and Gaza and mourn the terrible loss of life. We hope for an end to the violence and a political resolution to the conflict. And that's about as unifying a statement as I've ever seen in our movement, and it's pretty vague. Perhaps it's because our congregation is not so disunified on everything about Israel as that statement implies for our wider movement, and perhaps because we're a congregation that has become so accustomed to seeing eye to eye on issues like women's reproductive rights, LGBTQ equality, immigrant and refugee support, that many of us naturally harbor a desire to want to extend that spirit of congregational agreement to engage in public activism or sign statements about the current war. But as I've said, this is something we really cannot do under the current circumstances. I have become acutely aware of the diversity of opinion regarding these demands for a ceasefire from the, again, many conversations that I've had with members and the emails that I've received from them. I knew this would be the case, and that's why I wrote in my second commentary after the events of October 7th, only 10 days later, last Friday night, our sanctuary was packed as we took the opportunity of gathering to express our hopes for peace, even as we mourned terrorist slaughter of civilians on Simchat Torah. So this would have been on October, I believe it was 13th. While we were united that evening in our pain, we may be less unified as we now enter the uncertain future, much of which has revealed itself to us. With Israel mobilizing for what will surely be a prolonged war, many of the Jewish world's long-simmering divisions will undoubtedly emerge. And the same will happen in our humanistic Jewish communities, in our congregation. Certainly all of us will mourn the loss of innocent Palestinian lives. We are humanistic Jews after all. But there will be those among us who fervently oppose Israel's response, others who will view it as a just war, and still others who will feel tremendous ambivalence, torn between their love for humanity and their feelings that perhaps a military response is necessary or justified. Now, I didn't have to be a prophet to predict that that's exactly what was going to happen, and it did. Subsequently, among the emails that I received was one that asked whether or not, as the congregation's rabbi, there was some moral guidance I could provide regarding the war. It was then that I realized that I must, at my earliest opportunity, that's tonight, explain why there is not, at least not in the sense that I can do so in the name of humanistic Judaism. I explained all of this in my reply to that email. I pointed out the reality that the moral issues surrounding this war are not so easily agreed upon. I want to illustrate this by summarizing the views of both sides. I ask forgiveness for the necessity of sort of grouping people together based on the commonalities that I've seen, without regard, at least in this context, for the necessary subtleties of smaller differences. Let me start with those among us whose moral compass directs them to an understanding that sometimes, yes, wars are justified, and that this war falls under that category. These people believe that Israel is conducting the war within the parameters of international law. They believe, as Hillary Clinton recently stated, that an immediate ceasefire, one that does not include the surrender of Hamas and the return of the hostages, would be a reward to Hamas. They point out that it was Hamas that broke the previous ceasefires, and that it will break this one and any future ceasefire should it be allowed to remain in power. They maintain that Hamas is not a trustworthy partner for a ceasefire, that this track record proves it. Those on this side of the argument currently view support for the Israeli military action as justified. They do not believe that Israel wanted this war, pointing out that the effect the war has had on Israel, and this is something we don't hear a lot about, is actually quite tragic. Israelis continue to come under fire by increasingly effective rockets and other weaponry. These range from those in Hamas's stockpile, to those coming from Hezbollah in the north, to actual missiles fired from Yemeni Houthi militants. Furthermore, they point out there are 250,000, maybe you didn't know this, 250,000 displaced Israelis suffering through so many traumas along with their fellow Israelis in the aftermath of those deaths and the kidnappings. This is proportionally equivalent to the American population having experienced a dozen simultaneous 9/11 attacks. Think about that. They are sleepless out of concern for the hostages' safety. Their economy is in a state of free fall. Almost all of their young people are now in uniform, facing great dangers that keep their parents up at night. And they are very united, these Israelis, in the beliefs and the fears that it engenders that Hamas did not attack Israel because they oppose Israeli settlement policies in the West Bank. Many Israelis do. but because it is a right-wing religious extremist anti-Semitic terrorist organization that wants Israel and all of its Jews utterly destroyed, because it says so. For these reasons and many that I have omitted, those who argue against calls for an immediate ceasefire hold that this is a just war, one that is necessary in order to rid both Palestinians, you might have heard that at the rally if you heard any of it, and Israelis of Hamas. Now, what about those in our congregation and elsewhere who are calling for an immediate ceasefire and for support in this demand for an immediate ceasefire by the international community? Why have they taken this position? Their conclusion is that Israel's military attack is completely immoral. These include members of groups like the Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, and many others. And remember that I have long argued that JVP and similar Jewish groups deserve a place at the Jewish table. I wrote an article about it for the Detroit Jewish News 4 years ago, and they've never asked me to write anything again. Folks who support an immediate ceasefire see Israel's military invasion as primarily an act of vengeance, lacking any appreciable deterrence value. Some of them are convinced that Israel's ultimate goal is to reoccupy Gaza and/or to expel all or much of its population. And there are those in Israel who have said this. Some of them characterize Israel's military attacks as a form of genocide and/or argue that Israel is committing war crimes by responding to what happened on October 7th, as terrible as it was, they will all say, in what they consider to be a highly disproportionate manner. This manner, they say, is characterized by collective punishment for all Gazan Palestinians. One opponent of Israel's military action, a member of our congregation, sent an article to me by Jason Stanley, a Jewish professor at Yale University. The professor wrote this: "In its desire for revenge, Israel is engaging in the mass killing of innocent civilians, largely children, which may spiral even further out of control. Israel claims it is not targeting civilians, but what does such a claim mean when Israel is conducting such a fierce bombing of an urban area as dense as Gaza?" For this reason, Professor Stanley believes that an immediate ceasefire is the only moral response to the war, stating that the actions of the State of Israel, which are being committed in the name of Jewish preservation worldwide, because of these, it is incumbent on those of us who are Jewish, as he is, to clearly and openly call for a halt to Israel's assault on Gaza. And you've probably seen protesters wearing shirts for JVP, If Not Now, not in our name. If we do not, he continues, if we do not succeed in stopping this bombing, our children and grandchildren are at risk of inheriting a double identity, not just as targets of mass killings of civilians, but also as those who stood by when mass killings were committed in their names. As our congregation finds itself divided, we must each of us follow the humanistic Jewish guidance that speaks to our own consciences. Each of us engaging our commitment to critical thought and reason to locate our own position, or to reject the binary and find some way to deal with the ambivalences that we may feel, the doubts, the concerns. Whatever our commitments, whatever our doubts, whatever our concerns, there are plenty of places in the Jewish world where we can express them. And it is for this reason that I have taken that unpopular Jewish position of calling for JVP and similar organizations to have a place at the wider Jewish communal table. After the October board meeting, with its wise decision to reject taking any kind of singular position or calling for a ceasefire or not, I followed up with the members of the board, sending an email that restated my ultimate goal for us, what I would like to see from this congregation at this time. I wrote this: "After 10 years of service to our congregation, I have discovered that when it comes to Israel, we may not be quite as divided as some communities, but we are still divided. Our congregation includes members of Jewish Voice for Peace, alongside donors to the Friends of the IDF, and many people in between. We would not belong to this movement, I said, if we did not have very strong feelings about living by our values. However, as we participate in the discussions and debates about the war, it may be counterproductive, I believe it is counterproductive, to declare that only one position is properly aligned with humanistic Jewish principles. As things currently stand, this does not match the reality that very many committed humanistic Jews believe that their positions are reflections of their deeply held humanistic Jewish principles, and of course, two different sets of ideas at minimum. I concluded this little email to them, as I will this presentation this evening, with a reminder that as history unfolds, unforeseen events might lead us to a time when a clear consensus among us does indeed emerge. But until such a time, no one here, no one on our board, not even myself, is being asked to remain silent about our own convictions. As humanistic Jews, we endorse the right, we endorse the obligation that each of us has to honoring and sharing our own reasoning. We must, however, as a congregation, always endeavor to do so with the utmost civility. I urge all of us to navigate our way through our differences at this very, very difficult time in a manner that preserves us as the humanistic Jewish congregational family that we have always been. That is my goal as your rabbi, and it is the one thing that I ask that you all share with me. Thank you. So, in the spirit of peace, let's sing about it.
Odivo shalom aleinu, Odivo shalom aleinu, aleinu ve'akulam. Odivo shalom aleinu, Odivo shalom aleinu, Odivo shalom aleinu ve'akulam. Salam aleinu ve'akol ha'olam. Salam, salam, salam aleinu ve'akol ha'olam. Salam, salam. Odivo shalom aleinu, Odivo shalom aleinu, Odivo shalom aleinu ve'akulam. Odivo shalom aleinu, Odivo shalom aleinu, Odivo shalom aleinu ve'akulam.
Thank you so much to Joseph, to David Weeks, who volunteers every week to stream this, to Arthur for doing the slides, to all of you for coming. Let's go talk about it in the other room. Shabbat shalom.